Now, so in earlier tutorial, what we have seen is we have created a class called as x and a class called as y, and this class y extends x. So x here is a superclass and y here is a subclass. In x, I have a constructor and a method called as show. In y, I have two constructors, two overloaded constructors. One is with default parameter, or second is we are with your parameterized constructor. Now, if I pass, so we have done with this x obj equal to new x, new y. What we'll do is we'll say object of y only. So let me just go with one concept here, which is, let's say if I'm creating a reference of y and object of y, it will call a constructor of y, which is default constructor. And with this default constructor, it will also call the default constructor of x, because whenever you create object of subclass, you also get the object of superclass. And since you're getting object of superclass, it will call the default constructor of superclass, right? So if I run this code again, so let's say run Java application, the output is in const x, that is this default constructor, in const y, this is your default constructor of y, and since we are calling show, it will call this show, which is in show x. Now, I don't want to go for any overriding or overload method here, so I don't want show here, just to make your code more simple. But instead of calling a default constructor, let me pass a value which is 5. Now, if I pass 5, it will not jump to this default constructor, it will jump to this parameterized constructor. And we don't have any constructor, any parameterized constructor with x, so let's define a constructor. We'll say int I, and here let me say it is system.out.println, and we'll print here it is in const x para. Now, since we are passing a value, that means it will call the parameterized constructor of y, but the question arises, which constructor it will call of x, a default one or a parameterized one? Logically here, since we are passing the value, it should call the parameterized constructor of x, right? So the output should be it is in const x para and in const x in const y para, right? So let's run this, and to your surprise, the output is in const x and in const y para. That means since we are passing the value which is 5, it is calling the parameterized constructor of y. But unfortunately, or for us, it is calling the default constructor of x. Then question arises, why? Because earlier I said whenever you create object of subclass, you get the default object, or it will call the default constructor of superclass. So every time you create object of subclass, it will call the default one, which is a constructor without any parameter. Let's see why exactly it happens. It's because even if you don't write in any constructor, by default, the first line of your constructor is super. So it is specified there. So by JVM, by itself, it's add this statement after every constructor. It says super, which means if you call a constructor, it should call the superclass constructor. Simple. Then you will say, what about this? We have a constructor here, but x doesn't extend any other class. Then again, to your surprise, by default, every class in Java, any class, maybe class x or maybe class y, every class in Java extends one class, and that class name is called as object. So now what is object? Object is a class, inbuilt class in Java, which is extended by every class. So here also you have a method called as super, which calls the default constructor of object class. So since it is by default, we don't need to call the constructor of or we don't have to write extends object, because it is by default extended, right? So by default, we have this method called as super. Super will call the constructor of superclass, since we are writing super and bracket. Now what I want here is, when I pass 5, this 5 will jump here, and I want to call this constructor. So instead of calling a default constructor, I need to call the constructor with a parameter. So what I can do is I can pass here I. Now since we are not calling a default constructor, we are calling a parameterized constructor. So instead of calling the default constructor, it will call the parameterized constructor. So let me run this again. So if I say run as Java application, the output is it is inconst x para and inconst y para. Simple. So that's one of the use of this super method. In fact, in next tutorial we'll talk more about super keyword. So in this, what we have done is we have created the object of subclass, and when you create object of subclass, it will call the constructor as specified here. If you pass a parameter, it will call the parameterized constructor, but by default it will call the default constructor. In order to call the parameterized constructor of your superclass, you need to use a method called as super, and by passing some parameter you can call that specific constructor. Clear? So that is for this tutorial. So in the next part we'll talk about super keyword in detail.